Hey everybody, welcome back or welcome if this is your first time. I'm Dr. Alan Johnson, and on this channel I talk about the mind, well-being, productivity, and change for thinkers, makers, and everyone in between. And today I want to talk about the idea of slow reading as sort of a remedy to this shame that we can carry around with us when we buy the books and it sits on our nightstand table and we maybe read a few paragraphs or a few pages and it sits and it sits and it sits and we begin to feel worried or anxious about it. But what if that sort of slowness with which we approached that book wasn't a flaw? What if it was a gift, just a different way of approaching our reading? And today, I want to share something that has taken me years to really figure out and understand. Being a slow reader like that can be a great asset, not just for comprehension and retention, but for something deeper than that. It turns you into someone who lives wisely and well and doesn't just accumulate words. Now, I'm not talking about just sort of never picking up the book and never actually reading it, but I'm talking about a book that you might spend 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months reading. Maybe one book that you'll spend an entire year reading. What that experience is like. And here's the roadmap for this video. We're going to begin by talking about why slowness matters, talking about that from a spiritual perspective, from an intellectual perspective, and from a neurological perspective as well. Then we will look at 6 practical habits that you can begin today to cultivate a really powerful and empowering slow reading practice. And then finally, I'm going to end with a few closing reflections on how you will change when you approach reading in this different way, when you're focusing on what matters than just speeding through something. So let's begin by talking about why slowness matters. Well, we live in a culture of compression where speed is a currency and reading is often framed like some sort of productivity hack or some sort of sport that will do 10 books a week, or we see online courses for speed reading your way to success. But real intellectual maturity and real spiritual maturity doesn't come from that type of speed. It comes from dwelling with something for an extended period of time. And slowness invites us to overcome a sense of separation between ourselves and the book that we're reading. It invites us to overcome the separation between the nature of learning and really embodying that learning. And it invites us to overcome that separation between reading something and living something. Reading slowly isn't an indulgence. Reading slowly isn't a failure. It's a form of contemplative inquiry, really. It's a way that we can be with ideas until they begin to transform us. So, how then do we practice this type of slow reading? A positive slow reading, not a lazy, forgetful, disengaged reading, but an applied slow reading. Well, number one, I think a tip that we can do is sub-vocalize. That's when we read the sentences aloud in our own head. So this is how we first learned how to read when we were children. And as we became more advanced readers, we stopped sub-vocalizing, and that's how we begin to read more quickly. But there's something really amazing about the beauty of language that we can better understand when we return to sub-vocalizing, as we begin to hear how the words take form and the sounds that they create. It activates different neural pathways and creates a very different relationship between us and the book. And we are no longer just reading to get through something, we are dwelling with it, because sub-vocalizing requires us to slow down our pace of reading. That book gets to be savored. The next tip is keeping something called a commonplace book. A commonplace book is where you can keep your notes and quotations and reflections on what you've been reading. And there's a really long history of commonplace books. I have another YouTube video about that, which I'll link to. But we can take this very, very old tradition and bring it into our lives, because a commonplace book isn't just a notebook. It's an archive of what we've been reading and what we've been thinking when we've been reading. So as you're reading, write down those passages that really strike you. You might not even know why it felt interesting or important. Take that moment, take that brief pause just to write it down in your commonplace book. The next one is using a ritual to begin and end your reading. I talk about rituals a lot on this channel. I always point out that these can be really quite small. These don't have to be big, elaborate things. Maybe, for instance, when you are sitting down to read, there's a candle that you light to demarcate this moment in the day. Or maybe you take 3 breaths when you begin reading. Or maybe you read a poem before you begin reading a novel. It doesn't matter what you do as much as doing it regularly. So finding those little rituals to mark out your periods of slow reading at the beginning and at the end can create that sacred space and a container for your reading. Another thing we can do is asking reflective questions, not just analytical ones. So not just thinking about, what's going on here, or what does this particular passage mean, or what might the motivations of this character be. We can ask ourselves a different type of question. What is this passage asking of me? What resistance do I feel at this point in this book? What does this character say about me and my own attachments? This type of reflection during your reading leads to a form of contemplative dialogue with the book. And you can write these reflections in your commonplace journal. So the next thing, we can embrace repetition without shame. So reading something twice, reading something 3 times or 5 times is not failure. Whether there's one sentence that you just keep reading and rereading, either because you love it so much or because you don't quite understand it, that's great. Allow yourself to really experience that sentence. Maybe there's a book that you read every single year. That is also fantastic. There's an old Zen saying that you can never step into the same river twice. And I think exactly the same is true for a book. So embrace this repetition and don't think of that as some form of failure. And the final tip I have for you, and this is probably the most important one, is read fewer books, but read them more deeply. And all of my tips before gave you some suggestions for how to read more deeply. You don't need to read everything that was written. You don't need to read everything that you read a review of in the Sunday paper. You don't need to read the books that you think are important or useful or life-changing. All that you need to read is what is important to you in that moment. And that's the point. That's the entire point. Read deeply rather than reading everything. So, a few closing thoughts then on what this type of slow reading practice does for you. You're not going to just become a better reader. You're becoming someone who listens to books and knows how to listen very deeply. By cultivating your practice of slow, careful reading, you begin to notice the small things, and you begin to not just rush past mystery or ambiguity or nuance. And these are traits that extend into our own lives. This is the path of slow living, and this is how we grow. Our culture tells us that to grow and develop and change, we need to constantly be moving faster and faster and faster. But what's so interesting is that that doesn't seem to make our lives better or happier. What does is by committing to the simple, regular routines that bring us joy, such as picking up a book and lingering over it for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour. And that is rare. And that type of attention is beautiful and it is absolutely necessary. And if this resonated with you, I would love to know what book taught you how to slow down. Share it in the comments below, and I will be reading all of these recommendations. And if you'd like more on the slow life and thoughtful living, make sure to subscribe to this channel because this is the channel where I talk about living wisdom and not just sort of the quick fixes or hacks to get ahead. Thank you, as always, for being here. And until next time, keep reading and stay mindful. I'll see you then.